16th, 2022 work session. Just as a reminder to anybody who is observing this, we do not take any action during our work sessions. This is an opportunity for information and discussion amongst the commission, and we will take a short break once that's over before we convene our 5:30 business meeting. With that, I'll turn it over to you, Sarah. Board.
Thank you, commissioners. And I'm simply going to introduce Brooke Sauer, our finance manager, who's going to lead us through this conversation about the American Rescue Plan Act funds.
Thank
Brooke?
you, Sarah, and good afternoon, commissioners. Bear with me just a quick moment while I share my screen and we'll get the presentation started. Okay, thank you. This afternoon, I'll provide an ARPA recap. We'll talk a little bit about the CARES Act versus the ARPA funds and the differences between the two, the letter of interest process results, interested parties by business type, and then we'll talk a little bit about some of the upcoming timelines and some policy work that will take place for a formal competitive RFP or grant process. Then I'll open it up to commission for any questions that you may have about the presentation. So moving right along into the first slide, the CARES Act funding that the county received last year. I think it's important to talk a little bit about the differences between the two types of funding. And so I'll just kind of start with the CARES Act and then I'll say how the American Rescue Plan Act differed in that way. So with the CARES Act, there was a $400 million investment in Kansas counties. With the American Rescue Plan Act, it was a little bit more, $565 million. With the CARES Act, so this funding, and I'll talk a little bit more about it, but the money was passed through the state and we were required to adopt by resolution acceptance of that award, but we were also required to reimburse both cities, schools, and then also public agencies for costs incurred as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. With the American Rescue Plan Act, counties, cities, and schools, they all receive their own funding directly. So that was a little bit different about how that fund was distributed for those particular sectors. One of the biggest things that we can make a distinction between the CARES Act and the American Rescue Plan Act is that public sector revenue loss was not eligible under the CARES Act. So lost sales tax revenue, any sort of revenue generated by that sector could not be replaced. With the American Rescue Plan Act, public sector revenue loss is absolutely eligible. And also, with that being said, Treasury just released a new revision of the interim final rule. I like to call it the final rule. And with this newest revision, local governments or recipients of the fund can elect a standard allowance of up to $10 million. Treasury presumes that at least $10 million has been lost as a result of the pandemic, and you don't have to go through some rigorous calculation to support a revenue loss. So again, I mentioned counties received the funding as a subrecipient of the state of Kansas. They had a lot of rules around how we could administer the funds. With the American Rescue Plan Act, we received money directly from the Treasury. We are just bound to the rules as set forth by the federal government. Programs and projects under the CARES Act had to have a very clear nexus to pandemic-related response. Versus the American Rescue Plan Act, additional programming and projects are allowed for infrastructure, crime prevention, and services to disproportionately impacted communities, where the nexus to COVID may not be as clear. Funds could be used as match for a local portion of federal programs under the CARES Act. for the American Rescue Plan Act funds cannot be used as that local or matched portion of federal programs. With the exception of if you use the standard allowance, then it becomes unrestricted, it becomes your money, and then you can use it as local match. And then with the CARES Act, I'm sure you all are well aware, we had a very tight timeline for expenditures. Expenditures had to occur between March 1st, 2020 through March 1st of 2021, and that includes a 3-month extension, or 2-month extension, I'm sorry. Funds used for expenditures for American Rescue Plan Act funds can be incurred between March 3rd of 2021, so last year, through December 31st of 2026, with the caveat that those funds must be obligated or encumbered by December 31st, 2024. So contracts will be in place. You know, we will essentially make sure that those funds are obligated for a programmatic to be able to use that provision of the law. I'm going to talk a lot about this slide, even though it seems there's not a lot going on here. As soon as the CARES Act funding was exhausted, staff began tracking COVID-related expenditures. All of this was occurring while the American Rescue Plan Act was still pending legislation. We didn't even know if it was going to pass. But if it did, I wanted to be able to track these expenditures so that we could cost it to the fund if we did receive additional federal funding. Purchases for sanitation equipment, safe reopening measures, masks, sanitizer, and other related expenses continued to be tracked until the county officially accepted that award from the American Rescue Plan Act in early summer of 2021. Additional obligations for funding were made in the fall of 2021 to the Housing Stabilization Coalition for rent and utility assistance to provide gap funding for those who were either ineligible for assistance or were waiting for approval through the CARE program administered by the state. Funds were also allocated for a homelessness needs assessment around that same time. Staff then drafted and commission approved an emergency funding policy which allocated 10% of the total award, or $2.3 million, which allowed for the expeditious purchase of emergency services or goods. Through that process, a total of $216,000 has been allocated to public health or social service organizations since that policy was adopted in October of last year. An additional $264,000 is pending approval tonight on the board's regular business meeting. And if that is approved, the total funds allocated using that emergency funding policy will total around $480,000. The obligations to date include the expenditures to date, so the $320,469, plus the emergency funds that have been set aside for those expeditious purchases. Funds that are available to obligate either through a competitive process or an internal program total $21.1 million. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the letter of interest results. We'll go over an overview and then I'll provide the breakdown by each category for the submissions that we received. 139 letters of interest were received during that collection period. As you might remember, it was December 15th through January 31st of this year. And 102 letters were submitted by external agencies. 37 letters were submitted by our internal departments. In total, services to disproportionately impacted communities and public health submissions were the front runners, followed closely by negative economic impacts, then infrastructure and premium pay. There was one submission internally which had no category provided, but would be eligible only under that revenue loss category if we elected that standard allowance. And it is up to $10 million. If we elected $5 million, then that's what it would be. So externally, there were the greatest number of submissions for services to disproportionately impacted communities. And as you may remember in the slide I talked about earlier, that was one of the categories that was not included. A lot of those programs and categories that you could use were not included with the CARES Act. So that was kind of interesting to see. For internal departments, the most submitted category was for public health related programs. On this next slide, the project costs depicted on this slide here, they really run parallel to the number of letters submitted in terms of category for both the external and internal stakeholders. So the project submissions totaled $76.7 million. External project submissions were around 67, and internal project submissions total around 9.6. Of those internal project submissions, I would like to note that approximately $4 million serve an external purpose. External project submissions, oh, I said that, sorry. I'm going to go through and kind of break these down by category. I'm going to talk a little bit about this slide. So, you know, as we look at these infrastructure projects and premium pay, the scope of the programs that fit within the guardrails of the allowable uses for these categories are somewhat limited. There are only a handful of subcategories that can be used to design a program under this this primary category. For infrastructure projects, they're constrained to broadband, water, sewer, and wastewater proposals. It should be noted that the passage of the bipartisan infrastructure law, $55 billion in funding was set aside for water infrastructure projects administered through the EPA. The state of Kansas is expected to receive approximately $79 million in funding for these projects. It will go into the state revolving water fund. In addition to that, $42 billion in funding is included with the bipartisan infrastructure law for broadband equity, access, and deployment. This pool of funding will be administered through the U.S. Department of Commerce, and it's just one of many programs that are available for connectivity. Each state will receive at least $100 million. We may receive more. In addition to those federal opportunities, the state has also received funding for broadband projects from the Capital Projects Fund. This program is being administered at the state level by the Office of Broadband and Development at the State Department of Commerce. With respect to premium pay, you know, under that provision, equitable distribution of funds across both public and private sectors should be considered for this particular investment area. And I'll talk a little bit more about policy work in a later slide. Public health and negative economic impacts. The scope of programmatic ability broadens a bit with the public health and the negative economic impacts categories. 10 letters were submitted for mental health services, followed by 7 letters which detail projects related to capital investments or physical plant changes to public facilities that respond to COVID-19. 6 letters each were submitted for other economic support and job training assistance, citing negative economic impacts, followed by small business, economic assistance, household assistance, and household assistance for food programs with 5 letters each. Those were neck and neck. Letters submitted to provide services to disproportionately impacted communities showed the greatest interest in affordable housing and community health workers or benefits navigators with 6 letters each. There are the greatest number of subcategories available for programs administered for these for these services. This category applies to programs that were seemingly left out with the passage of the CARES Act due to the fact that the nexus to COVID, again, was just not that clear. On the next slide, I thought it might be interesting to show commission the interested parties by business type. So we can very clearly see that the investment, the slide shows the investment category, but also by business type. The greatest interest in investment is made by nonprofit organizations for services to disproportionately impacted communities at just over $20 million. I wanted to note that for ease in reporting that the government business type consolidates general governmental public health organizations, along with public utilities and housing authority letters. So those are all included in that first set of data there. This slide, I'd like to talk a little bit about, if it's the commission's intent to move forward with a formal RFP or competitive grant process. I wanted to have available for you tonight the timeline as it relates to both the launch of this program, and then also talk a little bit about how that kind of will commingle with our budget process. So I think it's important to make that note here. Tentatively, this is all tentative, we could begin accepting grant proposals the week of the 14th. I would like to draft a conflict policy and come up with a scoring matrix based on some guiding principles that we can kind of go through maybe here tonight. And then, so that will all happen in March. And then in April, that's when Tammy
Brooke,
owns our
maybe
budget.
before you move on to
yep,
April, if I
I'm
could
sorry.
interrupt.
Go ahead.
When you say begin accepting grant proposals, it's because we will have formally issued an RFP to the community
Yes.
that will outline what our priorities are, and they would begin responding.
Yes.
Just want to make sure we get that
Sarah.
step in.
I think that's a really great addition kind of to how I started that. So I appreciate you bringing that up. So yes, we would formally launch that RFP process at that time. And then Cami Owens, our budget manager, and myself and Sarah, we're going to do a lot of budget work there in April. So even though it looks empty, it's not. And then I would recommend to leave that RFP process open for about 45 days, which would look to be a tentative deadline for grant proposals around May 2nd. Once that May 2nd date hits, I would propose that staff will have analyzed and made recommendations and scored these proposals and provided those proposals and recommended proposals to the board on June 1st. And then propose a tentative work session, 2 work sessions, and then hopefully arrive at some board decisions by the 22nd. And this is all prior to the budget process where you guys will go and deliberate and adopt a budget in the summer this year. So that's the tentative timeline that we're looking at. Let's see here. I also attached the calendar, which includes both the 2023 budget timelines combined with the ARPA proposal process in tonight's packet. So you have that to look over if you have any recommendations or thoughts on that. And then I wanted to come back to the premium pay, the provision of premium pay. So, there's going to be some policy work that will go into some of this specifically as it relates to that particular category. For internal staff, there will be a significant amount of policy work that would be required to implement a premium pay plan that is equitable and appropriate for staff. The same considerations could also be made for external agencies using that same equity lens. So, you know, that's something that I've thought about since I saw that provision of the law after the interim final rule came out. And I just want commission to be aware that would be an undertaking. So with that, I would love to stand for any questions that you may have, discussion about this process and what your thoughts are.
Thanks, Brooke. And maybe you could pull down the presentation so that like folks could see everyone on there. I know, I think we kind of want to open it up to see how commissioners want to start on the conversation. I know there's a couple areas where Brooke and I'd like to get some additional feedback, so we may chime in with some additional questions to help get that. But I guess we want to turn the floor over to commissioners, see if you have initial questions on our presentation and where you'd like to take it from here.
Thanks, Sarah. Thanks, Brooke. It's Commissioner Reed here. Do you mind running through the those numbers of some of the infrastructure dollars that we expect to be coming down? I just want to make sure that I noted those right. I think I missed what they correlated to, except for that broadband piece.
Yeah, definitely. Almost there. Okay. Okay, so at the federal level, 55 billion in funding for water.
Okay.
Kansas is expected to receive, like they are making a direct allocation of 79 million.
Also for water.
Correct.
Okay,
Yeah.
thanks.
Yeah.
That's from that larger number.
Yes, correct.
Got it,
Yeah.
got it. Okay,
So,
yeah,
so
thank you.
Kansas's portion of that is that $79 million.
Got it.
Sorry, there's a lot of numbers in there.
Yeah, and I appreciate you going back because I kind of heard them all and oops, sorry. Started to mash them in my
Yeah.
head. So I appreciate the repeat. And then what was the number for the broadband
Yeah.
that we expect? Or
Yeah, so
potential?
that is $42 billion. Of that $42 billion, there is a handful of projects that fit under that. But the one that was really specific and in line with what the ARPA funding would cover was the broadband equity access and deployment, and each state will receive at least $100 million.
okay, thank you for clarifying
yes.
that part.
We usually, in Kansas, we usually get the at least amount based on population and so on. So, but we're guaranteed to get that.
Okay, thank you.
This
Uh-huh.
is Commissioner Portillo, and I'm hoping this is building off your question, so I hope it's okay to jump in. I really appreciate that we have these numbers. Do we have a plan, or can we create a plan for how we might communicate with folks who submitted proposals that may be eligible for these types of funds, for how they should be in touch with the state in those allocations, how they should be in touch with federal governments in those allocations? Like, what's the feedback loop on that?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked. So, you know, a lot of the rural water districts have been in touch with me, not necessarily so much the broadband infrastructure submissions. You know, I have talked a lot with them about the funding that is available at the federal level. I have all of their email addresses because they included that on the submissions. I would love to send them a follow-up and just let them know that these funds are available. Because, you know, when we talk about two separate pools of funding that are available for the same thing, leveraging the most federal dollars in our community is going to be key to getting these projects done and getting them done in a way that we're bringing more money here to our local community than, you know, if it were just to, you know, come from one source. So.
This Commissioner Kelly, do we know any of the guidelines for that? I mean, it sounds like we're sort of, is the assumption that many of our the proposals that are proposed here would be eligible. Do we know that yet, or we're still waiting for guidance on that?
Yeah, you know, the ones that I received, they would be, there was one infrastructure project that I think would actually fit under another category, but I left it there just for data reporting purposes. But all of the submissions that we received under the infrastructure category were qualifying projects. And from what I read from these federal sources, they would also qualify under this additional source of funding. Now, one of the things that I don't know if these programs are up and running yet, because this legislation is fairly new. It's going to take some of these departments at the federal level to begin to administer these plans. But I have a really great resource that I'd be happy to share, you know, with these folks too. So.
And I think that's important. Like, I think we want to be helpful to all the folks that are applying to just try to leverage as many dollars. I don't think we can guarantee, you know, we can't write their grants for them for the state level, but obviously, you know, we've served as a resource for how these funds come in over the last couple of years. And I think we would continue to try to serve that role. And we'd be open to more direct guidance from the commission in terms of if there's something you more specifically want us to make sure we pass along, we could certainly do that.
Yeah. And, you know, of all the categories, the infrastructure category has so much funding available from so many different sources. I mean, it is, it's quite amazing how many opportunities are really available under that specific category. So.
This is Commissioner Reed again. Yeah, thanks. I appreciate a bit more conversation around that, because I do think that particularly building further broadband infrastructure is very vital. So I'm excited about those funds coming and what that will mean for our county and our state. And really, it is important to me that we facilitate as much of that information and sort of direction to those funding sources as possible, because I'm very supportive of bringing those federal dollars, but to your point, want to really maximize that. And if we can reserve our county specific ARPA dollars for things that do not have other sources to look at, that's the sweet spot, right? So thanks for sussing some of that out and being willing to help communicate some of those things in the future, especially for our rural water district.
Absolutely.
Any other questions about Brooke's presentation from fellow commissioners? We'd like to hear a little bit more feedback from Sarah and Brooke about the kinds of things you're interested in hearing from us.
Well, I think you guys, we've already started this great dialogue as to where I think we're headed. And I think this conversation about infrastructure and kind of what, I think we looked at this in terms of like these broad categories. And infrastructure, and then we can talk about pay, or the two we'd like to start with, to sort of get commissioners' thoughts on how you'd like us to approach this. What I'm hearing so far is that there's a lot of desire to leverage funding and other sources for infrastructure. Is that something then you think would be less of a priority for our internal ARPA process, or is there more you all want to talk about there in terms of infrastructure?
This is Commissioner Portillo. I think that there are two pieces when it comes to both infrastructure and broadband for me personally. And the first is one that you've already spoken to, making sure that folks who submitted these things have access to the information for where they can find other funding. But I would say that if we're starting to move towards thinking about a scoring matrix for how we would score grant proposals coming into us, then funding or projects that have access to alternative sources of funding, alternative sources of federal funding, alternative sources of public funding, not asking people to go out and do bake sales or raise money, philanthropic money, but access to other federal funds that would score lower, because we want to do exactly what Commissioner Reed mentioned, maximize the federal funding coming into our community. And we do that by encouraging the projects that can get funding elsewhere to get funding elsewhere. So in my mind, we're preserving these funds for big one-time projects that can really move us forward with our goals, which I think gets to the other piece that you were asking about, Sarah, which is the pay piece. And I know we had quite a few requests for pay here. And I recognize the need for many of those requests, and many of them are incredibly compelling. But I would, as we're getting towards that scoring matrix, really focus in on those one-time projects that move us forward as a community. The pay premiums always kind of worry me a bit because I don't know how we'll continue to fund them once these funds run out. And there's so much need in our community for that. We could wipe out our funds addressing pay and not move forward with some of the big catalyst projects that we're hoping to accomplish with these funds.
I think that is important feedback. And just to remind everybody, just because we have a letter, if we leave a category in like premium pay, you will probably likely get more requests than what you're seeing in this letter of intent process. You know, what we're really there, we're not, you know, folks can still apply even if they did not submit a letter of intent. So I would say that if we signal that we want to include premium pay in our RFP process, you'll hear from a lot of folks.
I was trying to signal the opposite.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's what's clear about trying to clarify here is that how do you all want to approach that category?
So I am less supportive of premium pay, maybe for a little bit of a different reason. And that would be, I think that we have a lot of requests in here for populations, groups of people who have been negatively impacted by the pandemic and are in a very vulnerable place because of that. And I would want to direct dollars that way. I feel like when we direct it towards premium pay, it's a broad brush, just saying that everybody who worked in that sector, and while I appreciate the need and the work that they did, I share Sarah's concern that it will grow exponentially and could take away from some of the other projects in here that I'm excited about. I would also say that I'll stop there. Yeah.
This is Commissioner Portillo. I'm not attempting to move us off of the discussion of premium pay, but maybe towards more of a positive than just the negatives of things we don't want to see, but maybe towards things we do want to see. One of the main reasons that we had this letter of intent process was really to see kind of the breadth of projects that folks were interested in and have some exposure to, do we have people working towards some of the same goals? And I would say from a scoring matrix perspective, I would like to see collaboration or coordination by sector. So we see some of that in the discussions of some of the housing proposals, like how are we thinking about housing broadly, not just a single entity that's asking for a single project, but thinking about coordination in housing in our community. There are quite a few for economic development in here where it seems like individual organizations. And so anything that we're seeing, not every project is going to be coordinated, obviously, but if we see coordination across sector, I think that'd be a really helpful signal to us that this is something that may be more sustainable.
Commissioner Reed, I would agree with that sentiment. And when going through the list kind of retroactively after reading, I've noted all the things that I believed were economic development requests in essence, or from economic development partners. And it is noticeable to me, or seemingly, that there has not been necessarily communication or collaboration in that sector versus the example about some of the housing projects where there's some really clear conversations and partnerships that have developed some of those ideas. And I agree that that's really important. And it's actually what I'm pretty excited about this piece of the process. And I'm really glad that we decided to ask for letters of interest and get that breadth of ideas. And now that's published on our website for community partners, for business owners, for organization leaders to go in and see what other ideas people have and find where there's alignment and opportunity, and perhaps some economies of scale. And I think that there's some opportunities to really refine some of those project ideas, and collaboration will be a key factor to me, because I think that's something we value very highly in this community. And I think it speaks to the spirit of really thoughtfully and intentionally making a proposal that maximizes these dollars in a really sustainable way. And so, just looking at the whole numbers, right, when we were talking about, we have to get nearly $80 million worth of requests pared down to 21 million. And we need our community's help with, I think, a next phase of that, and really having conversations amongst each other about these different ideas and where there's overlap. And I'll also add to the premium pay conversation, it is my opinion that that is not the best use of these dollars. And I recognize that I agree with Commissioner Portillo that I think there's some really compelling asks, and I understand why, and that it's compelling to want to support some of those, but we would go through the money quite quickly. And I also, for me, these dollars are the opportunity to create lasting impacts for our community and move ourselves towards community-wide goals. So I'm really interested in the ideas and projects that are about building and creating new programs, new housing projects that are just creating things in our community.
So collaboration is a value for me, as well as we're thinking about how these groups work. I did see some opportunities for collaboration in other sectors besides economic development. There was some human service connections there, especially around food insecurity. That was, I'm not going to say it's redundant, because each project was really important and trying to address a specific need. But I do think there are opportunities for collaboration there that can maximize those dollars and make sure that while a net has two parts to it, a net has many parts, we also need to make sure that it's tied together and working as a system.
I could move on and ask you about some other categories if you're ready, as
Go
I'm
for
trying to
it.
make notes here. So another way we tried to slice this in terms of doing this, and I really appreciate the reframe into a positive angle. And as the commission knows, like as an administrator, sometimes that's a struggle for us. And the reason why is because we are trying to get us, this is $78 million in wonderful projects would all bring a tremendous amount of value. We have limited resources here. So it's a difficult situation to put you all in, where most of the folks you talk to, you're going to have to say, no thanks, because we just don't have the funds available to fund them. So I appreciate the reframe, and I'll try to keep it in that positive light. Another way to reframe it was, what are the types of organizations that have applied for funds? And then what is the kind of intersection between organizations that have applied and how those funds would be used in the community? Does it have a really broad base of the number of people the project touches, or is it a more limited scope of who's impacted by it? That's something we talked about. I guess I'd be interested in what the commissioners thought about that. And specifically, could that be used to prioritize how we prioritize projects, like a broader impact, or organizations that you're particularly interested in supporting or not supporting? So I'll throw that out there.
This is Commissioner Portillo, and I want to answer that question, but I also want to answer a question that I think is very adjacent to that. And we have these proposals divided as external and internal. I think one of the things that we've learned throughout this pandemic is that the administrative infrastructure of our county is incredibly important. We rely on our county government for a lot. And so I I think the broader impact is incredibly important as we move forward with deciding what we're funding, but we need to not count ourselves out. A lot of communities are actually just keeping these funds and using them all internal to government operations. We're choosing not to do that, but that doesn't mean we're choosing not to fund anything within the county, right? The administrative infrastructure of the county is incredibly important to me, and we have a lot of really compelling internal asks. So I think when we think about that idea of broader impact, we have to think about not just communities served, but really how we're developing institutions that we can maintain that will be meaningful in our community. And some of that is looking internal, and some of that is looking external. So for me, that broader impact really has to do with institutionalizing the kinds of values that we want to see in our community.
So I agree with Commissioner Portillo on building up the strength of our Douglas County our government services, that I think that's really important, and especially administration. And I would encourage administration to think about how we could use those dollars to support even this process. I mean, I think that's really critical. I think it's tempting in some ways to say like it has to serve a broad perspective, but I also, in reading some of the projects, think that sometimes it's really good to be very specific, especially some of those projects that are very equity focused or focused for a particular population. So I want to be cautious about just saying you have to serve everybody, everything, and it's the broadest impact, because I think sometimes the smartest impact is being very surgical about it and who you serve. And I hope that answers your question, Sarah.
Yeah, it does. I think, and maybe I didn't phrase it correctly. I think what I was trying to get at, and maybe I should just be a little bit more direct, is, we receive requests from other municipalities that also received ARPA funds. We received requests from private medical practices that where their reach might, I guess when I'm talking about the type of group, I'm trying to figure, are there some things in terms of the types of organizations that that you would like to encourage to apply? Or are there groups here that you feel, if we have to make distinctions, that we want to not target for further consideration?
This is Commissioner Portillo again, and I would say that we have talked a lot as a commission about centering the most vulnerable in our community. And I think that gets a lot to what Commissioner Kelly was just talking about how do we make sure that we're having projects that have an impact? And that may not be a broad impact. It may be that focusing with precision on a particular population. So I don't think that that's about type of organization, but I think it is about saying, how are we centering the most vulnerable and ensuring, again, that we have those public institutions that build the kind of community that we need. So for me, it's what are projects that are centering the vulnerable and helping the public, because these are public dollars. They should be going to build up public institutions.
This is Commissioner Reed. I think I would add to that that I have hesitancy about providing any of county ARPA dollars towards municipalities or schools. I have quite a bit of hesitation about all of those requests because of their own allocations of those dollars. And from an equity standpoint, if we aren't, I think it's primarily because they have received their own dollars, and also sort of similar to the premium pay discussion we were having, to provide support to all of the public and other public institutions throughout our county would probably wipe out those dollars relatively fast. And so I personally have an interest in social services and private-public partnerships. I think that there's some real potential for those ideas, but the other public institutions I have quite a bit of hesitancy about. I will also mention, because we had a handful of requests from faith-based institutions and churches, that I also have hesitance about providing these dollars for those institutions. But those are my personal opinions.
Oh, I just want to clarify that when I said supporting the public, I didn't mean supporting other public institutions. I meant projects that support the public. I would agree with you, Commissioner Reed, that other municipalities and schools received ARPA funding directly. And so I would like to see the county's ARPA funding going towards projects that didn't already receive ARPA funding.
Yeah, you never know what, we looked at this letter of intent in our meetings. And one of the things as I was reviewing the applications that struck me was we should have probably separated out, did you receive pandemic funds as your own entity? So as a city, as a school district, and another question, did you receive pandemic funding from an entity? So like, because it sort of mixed the two together there. And so for me, scoring it wise, like if you haven't received any money, I would put that first. Second would be as if you received CARES Act money on our first go around. And lastly, if you received your own allocation from the state or from the US Treasury, because those are decisions you needed to make on your own. And if you chose not to spend it on certain things, that was their choice. And then coming to the county to ask for it again. Yeah, I'm less comfortable with that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does.
Mhm.
I think so. I think, Brooke, does that provide some clarity? I think there's some ways that we can be clear with folks responding that this is where our priorities lie. And it does sound like we have some consensus around other municipalities that receive direct ARPA funds and faith-based organizations that those would not be eligible to apply for our process. I want to make sure I'm
This Commissioner Reed,
always, tell me if I'm not stating something you want me to state.
that's what I think the consensus is.
But Patrick,
But-
if I'm overly interpreting you, let me know.
I didn't weigh in on the faith-based, and I don't know. I mean, it depends what the project is and what they're trying to do. I have some other conversations I want to have about some of the faith-based applications here, but more
Okay.
for me was the division of, have you received them from Douglas County or the city, are you an entity that's the end result, or did you distribute funds? I'm not saying that very well, but
I think that you're articulating three distinct categories.
Yeah.
I will now turn on my mic and say that I think that you are articulating three distinct categories, and that's helpful, particularly as we're thinking about a scoring matrix, right? Like from category 1, people who haven't received any funds; from category 2, people who may have received funds from another distribution, CARES Act or ARPA funds from the city; and then 3, institutions that received their own ARPA funding. And we're prioritizing bucket 1, maybe bucket 2, we are deprioritizing bucket 3. I think on the faith-based piece, I am very hesitant to use any funding to support an individual faith-based organization and their individual goals. If there is a faith organization that may be part of a broader kind of social coalition doing something that's to the broader community, I didn't see that in these, but it's possible. I would be hesitant to say faith-based organizations aren't eligible. I will say faith-based organizations attempting to fund their own, it's weird to say their own economic hardship because of COVID, but their own hardship because of COVID, that is of no interest to me. Is that distinction
Yeah.
help?
yeah, that's sort of where I was
Yeah.
going, was like,
Right.
if it is
Community-based, if it's a community-focused.
community-based focus, and I'm
faith-based
gonna,
focus.
throw out like Catholic Charities or something, that
Right,
has
hear you
done
there.
work and has received CARES Act money.
And
Mhm.
I will say that I would prioritize non-faith-based because I always have concerns about proselytizing when we're involving faith-based organizations in like the delivery of public service and public goods. And that worries me for a whole host of reasons. And I recognize that a number of faith-based institutions can be a part of coalitions. that
Sure.
do good work.
And we've worked with those partners before, like Family Promise or some of those others. I could name a couple of them. I just didn't want to exclude
I hear
them
what you're
from the
saying.
process.
I think that's helpful. That distinction is helpful.
Yeah, this is Commissioner Reed. I appreciate you both for articulating that better and getting to the nuance of it. That's exactly it. Something that is has broad impact on the community at large, rather than perhaps just a church community, a singular church community, would make a difference.
So I'd like to talk a little bit about sustainability. And when I say sustainability, I'm talking about the financial sustainability of these projects and funds. I think it is very important to articulate to everyone listening or who that's interested in applying for these funds, and that as an administrator, I have significant concerns that in 2024 and in 2026, when these funds are expended, this money is one-time money. If we build programs and staffing and ongoing operating around these funds will run out. Your local government will not be able to sustain them in the future at this level without significant local tax increases. So we asked folks about sustainability. And I think we got a variety of responses, and which is fine in the letter, and you're just trying to get a heads up. But I am really concerned that if we fund ongoing operations, what happens at the end? And I don't know that we can want to eliminate it completely, because sometimes you can make a lot of good and folks work on a grant and then things can get taken care of. But at the same time, I guess I'd like to hear you talk a little bit more about your priorities in this place, and if there are some things we can do to assist you in getting that information in proposals.
So I'd like to go first on this one. This was the biggest concern I had reading over the letters of intent, was expression that these were sustainable projects. And though it was a short read, I felt like I'm not sure it is sustainable. And I'm all for innovative things, but we have to make sure that those innovative things can be sustained down the line. I get really concerned about the number of staff and projects here that we saw. And because of sort of the response that we got, I'm really hoping that staff will be willing to weigh in on what they feel is sustainable, because, we read a couple of applications that said, well, it is sustainable and we'll figure that out. And to me, that answer is lacking, and it's not really getting at it. And so that said, I think there is a space for a project that may not be sustainable, but be within the window of the grant. So within the window of the dollars that they're available, 26, is that right, Brooke?
Yeah.
That may happen. So it may be a project that you think, we're addressing this need, that need will taper off by 2026, and we don't plan to continue the activity beyond that date. That I'm more comfortable with. But in some of these, I don't see how they're sustainable, and yet some of the respondents said it was, and maybe I missed something, but I think staff's going to need to weigh in on that.
This is Commissioner Portillo. I immediately go to a process piece, and I'm thinking about that scoring matrix that we've been talking about. And the way that I agree with what Commissioner Kelly has said, there are some projects that are projects contained within that time period. There are others that are not. I kind of see this as, if you have a one-time expense, that's going to be, in my mind, that should be scored a bit higher, because that is using one-time funds for exactly what they're intended for, right? Like if this is building something, buying some piece of equipment that's necessary, doing something that is truly one-time, that's our best bet, because then we know that we're not creating something that we can't sustain. Secondarily, it would be a project that's contained within that time frame of, here is exactly how I'm going to address this in this span of time. And then third would be, here is a really solid plan for how I'm going to move this from one-time dollars to ongoing dollars. And I think that that's possible as well, because there are many nonprofit organizations that they just don't have someone who can work off of whatever grants they're currently on. And they can find other sources of funding. It's going to be a harder sell, but I think that there has to be a strong sustainability statement. And I would see that scoring matrix as one-time discrete projects and then a lesser interest in ongoing funds that have an argument for how they're going to move to something sustainable. And if you have no argument for how you're going to move to something sustainable, that's where like that's not going to be a strong application.
This is Commissioner Reed. I appreciate that summation and think that that is a good way to sort of divvy things up. And I would agree with Commissioner Kelly that having staff's input and ability to help kind of flush out, because I've recognized that these short narratives and kind of yes or no questions that we ask people to answer is not the full story, right? And so the next phase would be to really communicate what kind of things we need to know about real plans, and that the idea of sustaining a project is not enough.
And if I might add one more category to the three, because Commissioner Portillo talks about what I would call capital costs, if that's, but I think there also are some soft costs sometimes built into some of these projects of sustaining the staff to run that. That would be that would be one step down from Commissioner Portillo's first area. Yeah, 1A, because
yeah.
what I don't want to do is create a building, a program or something, and then come back to the commission in 2026 or even earlier, possibly saying, well, now I need the staff to run this. And that concerns me.
Couple other things I'd like to talk about. And I don't know that we have to solve this right now, but there was some conversation about what I would call direct versus indirect. And let me be a little bit more explicit. So we have a pretty large request in here, and we've been funding the Housing Stabilization Collaborative throughout the CARES Act and with our emergency funding for ARPA. That's providing direct housing and utility assistance. Then we had some groups request like housing and rent and utility assistance, but for a subset of folks. Like we had one request for Eudora-based, one for restaurant-based. There might be others. I'm just using those as examples off my head. It may be too fine of a point, but I guess I wanted to bring up, do we have some prioritization over like, should we want to fund more consolidated, direct, or how do you feel about like little pockets of rent and utility assistance for targeted groups? Is that at all clear?
It's
Okay.
totally clear for me anyway. And it reminds me of a note that I have when considering all these is exactly about that I think the HSC program and the community-wide emergency rental and utility assistance and resource navigation, those things that are meant to be broad across the community and directly available to community members to seek out regardless of where they work, regardless of what their job is. Because otherwise I think we can kind of go down another long rabbit hole of teachers and paraprofessionals, and we don't have any requests that I can recall off the top of my head anyway, specific to a fund that would support those working class folks with some economic impact. So I think that we could keep adding to that list, and I would rather have the dollars invested in a way that that really goes towards what I think we have valued as a commission in our budget process last year, and other work with HSC and other community partners over the last 2 years, is to really create a low barrier, centralized way for people to get support when they are economically struggling, and to get effective navigation to different resources that may be more nuanced than the pool of money for rent and utilities. So that's my opinion about that. And I think that that the funds can be more guaranteed to be more equitable in that manner. So that is important to me.
Quick question for commissioners on that one. I am supportive of direct funding versus indirect funding, but I'm interested to hear where we think equity lies in this. Are there specific populations that we think have been most hurt by the pandemic that should be prioritized? You know, you mentioned certain employers, and I agree with you on that. I'm just interested if there's space to think about, you know, maybe specific populations based on other factors.
This is Commissioner Portillo. I think I'm struggling with the direct versus indirect phrasing, just because like in the grants world, we use those words in different ways. So it seems like broad versus targeted, maybe the words that we're looking for in this particular discussion. And I hear what Commissioner Reed is saying about the, like, making sure that we're structuring things towards equity rather than structuring things towards exclusion. And I think that when we're talking about our goals, in my mind, again, it comes back to how are we supporting the most vulnerable? And that's a big part of what ARPA funds have asked us to do, right? The folks who are most affected and most vulnerable in our communities. And so that's where I can see some targeted support. But I would like anybody who is applying for these funds, and when we are scoring, how are we defining kind of most vulnerable and most impacted? And we know that communities of color have been disproportionately impacted. We know that our houseless population has been most impacted. And so I think that we may need to do some work to define vulnerable and impacted. In my mind, I think that we can look at the numbers there and we can see that folks who came into the pandemic with more social vulnerabilities exited the pandemic in worse shape. And so this may be something where we take a look at the social determinants of health, which map on really well here, and say, like, how are you addressing one of these factors? We could put almost every single one of these projects into one of those factors. But I think that we should allow folks who are applying for these funds to make an argument for how they are addressing the most vulnerable in our community and people who have been disproportionately impacted. And ARPA does define that.
That's great to hear. That's what I was hoping for. What was that we were thinking along those lines. And we did an equity analysis tool when we did CARES Act, and I think we learned a lot from that. I think we can use ARPA and sort of some of the things that it says in there where it defines some of those categories and ask the applicants to really define how are they prioritizing or addressing those disparities that we see and how COVID has impacted those communities.
That reminds me, so we've talked about using an equity impact analysis tool for this process, somewhat similar, but not probably exactly the same as what we did for CARES Act. We want to work on that. I think that's something as staff we're still working at. So when we bring you back sort of the sample RFP, you'll see more on that. I think we did learn a lot. And I think there's something in terms of definitions that we learned from that process that we probably need to define that better.
There are some really great models out there, and I'd be happy to share some.
We'd
you would
love
like.
to have them.
Yeah.
I have
Thank you.
one other area I want to make sure we cover, but I don't want to interrupt if you've got another comment on
I just
that.
wanted to add on to that real quick, that I really appreciate you asking that question, Commissioner Kelly, and your kind of reframing of that. And just another particular population that comes to mind are folks with disabilities and that are particularly and chronic illnesses and medically vulnerable. And that, I mean, just anecdotally from my service work experience, knowing that, I mean, the pandemic has been particularly difficult for folks like that. So I would really appreciate better definitions and kind of some ways that we are communicating very clearly in the RFP process, how we are defining those categories, and hopefully lead people to really be clear about how these dollars would have that direct impact.
I want to come back briefly to internal projects or projects that were submitted by county departments themselves. I think as we look at how these are structured, there's a couple of different ways to structure them. There were a couple projects submitted by administration that really are, in my view, community-based, broad-based, community-focused based projects. There's a large conversation around the Housing Stabilization Collaborative and our ongoing work with that, and equity, advancing racial equity project, as well as some, there's one other one that I'd like to consider those as a part in the review process with the other community-based projects, because they're external facing, they're community-based projects. The projects submitted by departments themselves for projects ourselves, I really appreciate Commissioner Portillo's comments about how we do need to support ourselves, and I really appreciate that. My proposal to the commission is that for those internal based projects that are, and I hate to say that they're not community focused, because everything we do here at Douglas County is community focused. So, but I'm going to say probably, I'll think of a way to define it so that I can bring it back to you with a little bit more clarity. But those projects that are slightly more internally based focused, I'd like to not have them, I'd like to run a parallel process to the community-based process. So maybe not have them fill out a complete RFP and compete against community-based projects. What I'd like to be able to do is set a target dollar amount that is reserved for these internal based projects, and bring you a recommendation for those projects inside that pool. Am I being clear? I'm afraid I'm not explaining that well.
I think you're being real. This is Commissioner Portillo. I think you're being really clear. I hear what you're saying. It's going to be hard to compare internal and external. My concern is that, well, I have two concerns. One is exactly what you said, that we have some that are very community focused and some that are more administrative infrastructure focused. And so trying to really parse out what is internal, what is external. Some of them are clearly internal, and that's obvious. And some are clearly community, and that's obvious. And there are some that are kind of in between, and that becomes a little bit harder. And so I have some concerns with, like, what is the break point for that?
Yeah.
I guess the second piece is, do we have an idea of the amount of funding that we want to set aside? Like I said, many communities just kept it all internal. We've made the choice that we don't want to do that. We are not necessarily saying we want all of it to be external. But when I saw those pie charts of the breakdown, and I'm not asking you to bring it up again, Brooke, but I don't know if we want to do it by percentages of asks that are currently in, if we want to set particular numbers off of something else. I don't know if you had a suggestion for that, or if my fellow commissioners have an idea for that, because that's where it doesn't, I don't know what our decision point is there.
Right now, as staff did their very initial review, so like very initial review, I would say that I think that I'd like to have more of a range so that we can kind of work within a range there. And then and right now I'm thinking somewhere between 3 and 4 million, based off of what I saw, which is probably even low. I see the look on your face.
Yeah, that feels real low to me.
Okay.
I was thinking, like, are we saying 33%? Are we saying 50%?
Okay.
But I would say a range between 25 and 33% of the overall funding for
Okay.
internal projects.
Yeah, that was going to be my comment, is don't shoot too low,
Okay.
because
Because again, this is administrative infrastructure for our entire community.
Yep.
We relied on the county for so many things during the pandemic, and we recognized how strained our resources are. And as we go through this process, there is a huge administrative burden for even distributing these funds.
Yes.
Because when I am looking at all of the folks who have to also get our annual budget going and do this process, like we need to think about capacity internally as well. And that is incredibly important to me.
And I appreciate what you said about a dual process, because I think it would be good to establish that before we look at those externals, like here are the dollars, because in my mind, the administrative structure, the things we do in Douglas County need to come first and then look at those outside projects. So we would need to consider that and go through that and understand what those projects are. Some of the projects that were in here, I think may have been budgeted for CIP. And so, as we balance that out, that may push our timeline back a little bit to ask you to do that work first. But I don't have a problem with pushing the timeline back a little bit if we can give clearer guidance to those external groups that are asking for dollars.
I'm okay pushing the timeline back as long as this still wraps up before budget. Because I do think it's incredibly important that we have decisions about ARPA done before we go into our annual budget process.
I think we can make this work. I think we can, when we bring back a sample RFP for our draft RFP that we would be releasing, and our goal for that is mid-March. I think we can have this internal, how we look at internal projects kind of worked out for you with this target amount and and run the parallel processes. I think we can, and by reserving some of those funds, you are prioritizing our internal services and our internal infrastructure. So I think we can bring that back to you at that stage. Then we can continue to work with our departments while external partners are working on their applications. And I think we can bring something back together. It's just that hard to compare, like, how do we support our own internal infrastructure against so many great, wonderful community-based projects? I know there's a lot of department heads that are just, they feel like sometimes and it's just really great to hear from our commission, their support for that internal infrastructure. So I feel confident that we can do that, but obviously you all can give us some feedback onto that process if you don't feel like we've done enough detail. Or I don't think so I'm not saying we'll make decisions by March. We will have a process for how the internal will be done. And we'll have that better defined when we bring you back a sample RFP.
This is Commissioner Reed. I think that is a really great idea, and I'm glad the conversation went there. And for the record, would agree that 25 to 33% target area of really trying to, I want our administrative staff to prioritize ourselves, as has been mentioned. And I do think that there's value in thinking about that a little bit separate from the truly external dollars going out into other people's hands to distribute it to our community. And so I appreciate that discussion and think that that's a really appropriate target number. So it is 5:13 right now. I just want to check in and see if there's any additional questions or comments. Brooke, do you have anything else for us you want to clarify?
No, commissioners, other than, like Sarah said, I'm going to take what was said tonight and come up with some really great questions to score for that RFP process. I'm hoping to hopefully have that drafted in the next few weeks so that we can really stick with that timeline of launch on March 15th. And so it looks like we'll probably see you again here in a few weeks with that draft RFP. And yeah, one thing I do want to thank all of the folks involved in this process, from external stakeholders, internal departments. I really appreciate all the information that we were able to collect and gather for this presentation tonight. So.
Brooke, I just want to say a huge thank you. You organized an intense amount of information and made it really accessible to our community and to us as a commission. So thank you for the presentation, and thank you again for all of the help that you were doing with all of the folks who reached out about this and connections to federal funding and all of those pieces. So thank you for your work on this. I appreciate it.
My absolute pleasure.
As Commissioner Reed would echo that. Really am grateful for how, excuse me, easy to digest this information was. And I think that's a really helpful first phase, not only for us as a commission and you all as a staff, but for our communities. So, and I also just want to recognize that we know this is a lot of additional work to squeeze in before our regular budget process. So we really appreciate you prioritizing that and making it work, because I do think that that's an important timeline to keep, but I recognize the strain. So I thank you very much for all of that energy.
And I would just add, of course, thank you, Brooke and Sarah and your whole team. And I also want to thank all those folks who submitted letters of intent, because without that information, it's hard for us to start to prioritize where we're at. And it is clear the need is high, and the need is higher than we have dollars for. And I don't want any of our conversation to dismiss the need that's out there. But we do have to prioritize, and we appreciate all those folks who turned in those letters of intent and are considering completing the RFP process, to understand that we're not dismissing the need. We just have to prioritize where we spend those dollars. So thank you for understanding that.
All right, thank you, everybody. With that, we will take a break until our 5:30 business meeting begins.